January 12, 1942, Lingayen Gulf, Luzon, Philippines. Boots crunched over coral sand still cooling from the night's rain. A thin mist clung low over the beach, glowing faint blue in the first smear of dawn. The smell of diesel floated from a line of Japanese trucks idling in silence, their canvas flaps twitching in the wind like nervous hands. 30 women, Japanese civilian nurses, clerks and wire service typists, huddled near the water's edge, bare ankles whitening in the cold surf. 4 hours they had waited at gunpoint, bracing for the worst without knowing what form the worst might take. One of them, 26-year-old nurse Aiko Nakamura, kept her eyes fixed on a single detail. A dropped glove half buried in sand, fingers curled as if reaching for someone who never returned. She believed she would die beside it. But the man approaching them in careful strides was not Japanese. His coat was Canadian khaki. His breath steamed in the dawn. And as he drew near, the women silently rehearsed every cruelty they had heard the Allies inflicted on the defeated. They braced for shouting, for the bark of a foreign order they would not understand. The first word they heard was, "Please." In that single syllable, spoken softly but firmly by Captain Edward R. Lambert of the Winnipeg Grenadiers, the air shifted. Something impossible flickered through the tension. Dignity in the place where fear had rooted itself so deeply. They screamed at the knock, and wept over a cup of tea. The contradiction would follow them for years. The moment was brief, almost fragile. Lambert paused, lowering his rifle slightly, and motioned for his men to stand down. His NCO glanced at him, unsure, but followed. The women stood frozen, half ready to obey, half ready to flee. The surf whispered behind them. "Please," Lambert repeated, this time gesturing gently toward the trucks. "You'll be safe inside." None of them moved. Only the trembling of their sleeves betrayed life. He stepped back, deliberately showing empty hands. It was not kindness, just restraint. A small act that thundered louder than gunfire. One by one, the women allowed themselves to be guided toward the trucks. No one dared speak. Sand clung to their bare feet, and every step felt like crossing a line between the world they were told to expect and the one they now entered without a map. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. They were captives now, but they had been many things days earlier. Aiko the nurse. Mari, a journalist's apprentice who once dreamed of writing children's books. Yuki, a village girl trained in shorthand so she could support her widowed mother. They had come to the Philippines for work, not war. But work turned to panic when gunfire rose across the archipelago in December 1941. Most were civilian auxiliaries attached loosely to Japanese military hospitals or communications units. They had tended wounds, typed dispatches, carried messages. None expected capture. The Japanese advance had been swift, until it wasn't. As Allied counterforces swept through pockets of resistance, these women found themselves stranded between collapsing lines. A patrol discovered them hiding in a bamboo hut near the coast. They were marched to the beach at dawn, ordered to wait for processing. The word hung over them like a sentence. The trucks rattled along a narrow coastal road, suspension groaning with every rut. Inside, the women sat on rough wooden benches. The smell of canvas, sweat, and engine oil filled the cramped space. No blindfolds. No blows. Just movement and uncertainty. Lambert rode in a jeep behind them. He watched the horizon as if searching for something more dangerous than the prisoners he escorted. His orders were clear enough. Evacuate civilian captives to the temporary holding station inland, treat them according to Geneva principles as far as circumstances allowed. But nothing in training prepared him for the terror in their eyes. None of these women were soldiers. They were, despite the uniform fragments some of them still wore, ordinary. Exhausted. Damaged by weeks of running, hiding, and hunger. The convoy jolted over a washed-out bridge. Aiko clutched the bench, knuckles whitening. She felt the weight of every stare from the Allied guards riding along the tailboard, though no one spoke. When the trucks finally slowed, dust rose around them like smoke. The outpost was little more than a ring of tents, a cook fire smoldering low, the distant clink of tools on metal. A sentry opened the gate. Inside, the women were led toward a large mess tent. They hesitated at the entrance. Lambert approached with a tin kettle and a row of mismatched enamel mugs. He set them on a crate. Steam curled upward, carrying the faint scent of Ceylon tea. "For you," he said simply. No elaborate gesture. No speech. Just a nod toward the warmth they hadn't expected. The women exchanged glances, suspicion wrestling with need. It was Aiko who stepped forward first. Her hands shook so hard she nearly dropped the mug. "I have not tasted tea since December," she would later write. But it was the warmth in his voice that frightened me more than the rifles. She lifted the cup to her lips. The world did not collapse. No trap. Just heat and steam, and the unfamiliar ache of being treated as a human being again. Humane treatment was not improvisation. It was policy, repeated and underlined through Allied channels. A memo stamped War Office, 1940 stated bluntly, "Prisoners are soldiers, not slaves." In practice that meant three principles: security, diplomacy, morality. Allied command knew every act of discipline, every ration, every blanket sent to a prisoner would echo outward to their own captured men across the Pacific. An equation of restraint, upheld even when rage tempted otherwise. But for the women captured on Luzon, this was not policy. They felt it as texture, breath, and time. As the hours stretched into evening, their fear eroded grain by grain. Daily life settled around them like an unfamiliar coat, itchy, stiff, but warm. The women were escorted to canvas tents arranged in neat rows. Each tent smelled of dust and wool blankets aired in the sun. Guards checked their belongings politely but thoroughly, laying items on a tarp with deliberate order. Combs, notebooks, a chipped lipstick tube, a torn photograph of a family posed before a plum tree. Aiko watched as her kit was examined. The guard handling her things paused over a small cloth pouch. Inside was a snapped-off fountain pen nib and a few grains of rice, her last attempt to ration hope. The guard returned it with a quiet, "You may keep this," and she felt a strange ache of gratitude. Meals were plain but consistent: barley porridge in the morning, tinned stew at midday, rice and cabbage in the evening. It was more than they had eaten for weeks. Hunger, once a roaring beast inside them, softened to a dull reminder. They were asked, never ordered, to sweep their tents, wash their bowls, fold blankets. Routine became the architecture of their days. Aiko found comfort in the scrape of metal basins against rock, the rhythm of washing, the shared murmurs of conversation creeping back into their voices. At dusk, music crackled from a field radio near the British sergeant's tent. Not songs of triumph but soft strings from a distant broadcast, something European, slow and aching. Mari paused outside the mess tent when she first heard it, thinking the sound was a hallucination after so many weeks of silence punctured only by thunder and gunfire. The guards spoke little beyond instructions, but their neutrality itself was a revelation. No jeering. No blows. The women had been told to expect humiliation. Instead they received procedure, discipline, predictability, and the astonishing luxury of being unafraid to sleep. Several days passed before the first moment of true connection. Small, almost accidental, but it rippled deeper than anyone expected. It happened on a gray afternoon as the women lined up for medical checks. The Allied doctor, Major Halliday, examined them with brisk motions, measuring pulses, checking for infection, noting weight loss. One by one, the women exposed arms trembling not from cold but memory. When Aiko's turn came, she hesitated. Her wrist bore a fading bruise from a collapsed ceiling where she had sheltered during shelling. She feared he might mistake it for resistance or worse, punish her. But Halliday simply lifted her arm gently, turning it under the lamplight. "You've been through too much," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He cleaned the bruise with iodine, his touch careful, almost apologetic. Aiko swallowed hard. "He held my wrist as if it mattered," she later wrote. "Not as a guard seizing a prisoner but as a doctor holding a patient. I did not know a single gesture could make me want to live again. It was the first human act. The pivot. The moment decency broke through the shell of fear that had become their world. Life in the camp developed its own rhythm, steady, predictable, and oddly domestic. Each morning the women swept the crushed coral paths between tents. The British quartermaster issued soap flakes once a week, wrapped in brown paper stamped with the Red Cross emblem. The scent, sharp, chemical, strangely comforting, became part of their daily landscape. Letters were not permitted but writing was. Mari borrowed a dull pencil stub from a clerk and spent evenings recording fragments of thought on the backs of discarded ration labels. Her handwriting grew steadier as the days passed. "I hear laughter again," she scribbled one night. "It startles me. It feels like defiance." Yuki helped mend torn blankets in the supply tent. She had grown up sewing kimonos with her mother, and the rhythmic pull of needle through wool steadied her nerves. The Allied sergeant, a man with a quiet face and a mustache trimmed with mathematical precision, often paused at her work table. "You stitch straighter than any of us," he noted one day. Yuki bowed her head, uncertain whether gratitude was allowed. He added, "Would that my own uniform held together so well." For a heartbeat, she let herself smile. Tension did not vanish, it ebbed. Cultural distance remained as vast as the ocean separating their homelands. But every small gesture, routine, respect, restraint, chipped away at the propaganda that had warned them the Allies would treat them like animals. Instead, they were treated like people. Not friends. Not equals. But humans. And in war, that was a radical thing. Even with the camp's rhythm settling around them, the deeper logic of the place, the invisible spine holding the whole fragile ecosystem together, revealed itself slowly. It wasn't charity. It wasn't leniency. It was civilization under pressure. A single paragraph could have explained it, if the women had been able to read the documents tucked into the camp office files. A War Office directive marked 1940, reaffirmed in 1941 and again after the fall of Hong Kong. Prisoners are soldiers, not slaves. Not a flourish. Not a sermon. Just a rule. A belief that order must survive even when the world forgets it. Security. Diplomacy. Morality. 3 words that shaped the way the guards moved, spoke, and even breathed around their captives. For the women, it manifested as small visual truths. The regularity of meals, the impartiality of guard rotations, the way confiscated items were tagged and stored rather than looted. Civilization made visible in wool blankets, in lined queues, in the brass whistle that signaled lights out each night. A cold, procedural mercy, and yet mercy all the same. Over time, daily life acquired depth. Patterns. Faces. Quiet revelations that stitched themselves into memory like hidden seams. Winter rains swept through the valley, turning paths into slick ribbons of mud. The women walked carefully, holding their skirts up, the damp clinging to their hair. There was no luxury here. Water was rationed, soap precious, privacy nearly non-existent, but restoration came in subtler forms. One morning, as they collected breakfast tins, a British corporal set a bucket of hot water near the tent flap. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain. He simply placed it there and walked away. Hours later, after chores and inspections, the bucket was still warm. The women washed their faces in turn, steam rising into the chill air. Aiko cupped the water in her palms. It smelled faintly of iron and wood smoke. She murmured a thank you to no one in particular. Kindness unsettled her more than captivity. News drifted into camp like weather. Fragments overheard from radios, occasional updates from officers. Rumors of battles in Malaya, setbacks in Burma, fierce fighting across the islands. The world was moving with brutal speed, but within the camp time felt strangely suspended. A holding of breath. In the evenings, lanterns glowed against tent canvas, creating silhouettes that looked like paper theater. Conversations whispered softly, memories of home, worries for family left behind, hopes they barely dared speak aloud. Yuki often repaired uniforms in the supply tent late into the night. Her hands moved with instinctive grace, stitching torn seams under the dim yellow bulbs suspended from the ridge pole. The sergeant would sometimes pause her work, offering a cup of weak cocoa or half a biscuit saved from his own ration. She never knew what to say in return. Words felt insufficient. "I meant to quiet my mind," she wrote on a scrap of paper. "But sometimes the quiet frightens me more than noise." It was in these quiet hours that distrust slowly softened. First in glances, then in posture, then in the rhythm of daily cooperation. The women began sweeping the paths not out of obedience but habit. They helped carry water barrels. They took turns washing cooking tins, talking softly among themselves. One afternoon, as a rainstorm broke suddenly over the camp, the guards hustled the women beneath the mess tent canopy. Thunder rolled low across the sky like distant artillery. The sergeant noticed the women flinch and quietly turned up the volume on the radio, letting a gentle instrumental piece drown out the storm's echoes. Mari closed her eyes against the wash of violins. "I had forgotten that music could soften fear," she later wrote. But tension never vanished completely. It changed shape, becoming a shadow rather than a blade. The women remained prisoners, the guards remained armed. Lines were clear if softer. A mutual awareness existed, wary, cautious, tinged with something approaching respect. Yet it was in the smallest, most unexpected moments that something more complicated began to grow. The first vignette came near twilight. Lambert, the Canadian officer who had first approached them with pleas, walked the perimeter fence, checking posts as he always did. He carried a clipboard, pencil tucked behind one ear, expression set in the neutral mask of command. As he passed the women's tent, he heard someone coughing, the deep, rattling kind that signals exhaustion and fever mixed with damp air. He paused and stepped inside the threshold. Aiko sat hunched on her cot, blanket pulled tight. "You should report to Major Halliday," he said gently. She shook her head. "It is nothing." But her voice wavered and Lambert set down the clipboard. "You are no use to anyone sick," he said in the same tone he might have used with one of his own men. "Especially yourself." It was not softness. It was duty. But duty dispensed evenly feels like justice. And justice in war feels like mercy. He left her a small tin of lemon lozenges, contraband from a Red Cross parcel. She stared at it long after he left. One morning she sat repairing a tear in a British ensign flag. The fabric felt oddly symbolic, mending the emblem of those who had captive power over her. Yet the work steadied her. The sergeant approached, watching her precise stitches. "You've saved us the trouble of requisitioning a new one," he said. She bowed her head, murmuring polite acknowledgement. After a moment he asked, "What did you do before all this?" "Sewing," she answered. "For weddings." He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of it, a seamstress stitching garments of joy now repairing symbols of war. "I hope," he said quietly, "you mend wedding clothes again someday." Yuki's breath caught. For the first time she felt seen not as an enemy, but as a person with a life before barbed wire. She had been writing fragments of stories on ration labels. One evening a gust of wind scattered them across the mess tent. Papers fluttered over boots and crates. Embarrassed, she scrambled to retrieve them. A British clerk bent down at the same time, collecting the slips. He picked up one with a short line in Japanese script. "What does it say?" he asked. Mari hesitated, then translated, "It is possible to feel safe, and guilty for feeling it." The clerk returned the paper with a small nod. "No judgment. Just understanding." "You write well," he said, then stepped away, leaving her more startled than flattered. Tension dissolved further when life's simple inconveniences demanded cooperation. The women, unfamiliar with Allied rations, struggled to light the small cook fire used for boiling water. One morning, after repeated attempts, the fire sputtered out again. Smoke curled upward like a fragile ribbon. A British private, passing by on his way to the armory, stopped. Wordlessly, he crouched and arranged the kindling in a careful pyramid, striking the match with practiced ease. Flames rose, steady and confident. He stood, brushed soot from his hands and walked away without waiting for thanks. Mari whispered, "Why would he help us?" Aiko answered softly, "Perhaps because he can." Propaganda had shaped their expectations. They had been told the Allies were brutal, merciless, indifferent. They had been told surrender meant degradation, humiliation, perhaps worse. But day after day reality rewrote those fears. A guard lending a glove on a cold morning. A medic offering extra bandages. A quartermaster discreetly replacing a torn blanket. None of it erased the fact of captivity, but it softened its edges, transforming survival into something more than endurance. One afternoon, the ideological shift crystallized into something the women could no longer deny. It began with a photograph. A heavy-set British guard named Thompson paused outside the women's tent during a lull in duties. He leaned against a post, adjusting his belt. Rain drummed softly overhead. After a moment, he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small photograph. A woman in a plain dress, holding a newborn swaddled in blankets. His posture softened, the way men change when reminded of home. Aiko noticed him staring at the picture. Their eyes met briefly. Thompson hesitated, then angled the photograph so she could see it more clearly. "My wife," he said quietly. "And our boy." Aiko stared, unsure how to respond. The image ache within her sharpened. She had left behind a younger brother, a mother who stitched white cotton tabi for winter markets, a life now impossibly distant. Thompson cleared his throat and tucked the photograph away. "War makes strangers of us," he said. "Doesn't have to make monsters." He walked on, leaving Aiko standing in the doorway, her heartbeat loud in her ears. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. The next shift, though small, was profound. The camp had been built for transients, a way station, not a final destination. And yet life had begun to settle into the cracks, growing quietly in the spaces between hardship and restraint. One evening, the camp cook found himself short of salt. He muttered in frustration as he stirred the pot of cabbage stew. Mari, passing by with an armful of laundry, hesitated. She rummaged through her belongings and produced a small drawstring pouch, remnants of Japanese seasoning from before their capture. She held it out. "For the stew," she said softly. The cook blinked, startled. "Are you sure?" She nodded. He measured a pinch into the pot, tasted and grinned. "Much obliged." As Mari turned to leave, she heard him call after her, "Right good flavor that." She walked back toward her tent, unsure whether to smile or cry. But the most startling moment came the following week, when the sergeant, the quietly precise man whose mustache curve never changed, gathered the women near the supply tent. "You've all been cooperative," he said. "Commands approved an expansion of personal time after evening meal. You may walk the inner yard until sunset." The women exchanged glances. Freedom, even a few yards more of it, felt enormous. As they wandered the yard, under watch but without rush or orders, they moved like people relearning the feel of their own limbs. Aiko traced the fence line with her eyes, noting how the setting sun lit each strand of wire in gold. Yuki observed tiny white flowers growing between stones. Mari inhaled deeply, letting the cool air fill her chest. This too was part of the ideological erosion, the realization that captivity lived on a spectrum, and that respect could widen even its narrowest confines. Yet the shift was not one-directional. The guards too found themselves changed. One evening, Thompson noticed a rip in the cuff of Yuki's coat. Without comment, he left a spare thread spool and needle on a crate outside the women's tent. She found them at dawn, dew-beaded and glinting faintly. She understood the message, an offer without obligation. Another time, the clerk who had admired Mari's writing slipped her a dull pencil stub, wrapped carefully in a slip of paper. She unwrapped it slowly, finding a single line in neat English script. "Words survive what we cannot." She carried the pencil in her pocket for days before daring to use it. Cultural conflict remained, restrained but real. One morning, during roll call, a misunderstanding sparked when a guard misinterpreted a bow as an attempt to avoid eye contact. Voices rose. Tension flared. Lambert stepped in immediately. "Stand down," he said sharply. "It's a sign of respect in their culture." The guard muttered an apology. Aiko bowed again, slower this time, unsure whether to risk repeating the gesture. Lambert nodded, meeting her eyes, and the moment dissolved. But both sides remembered it, a reminder that even goodwill requires translation. The ideological fallout reached its quiet crescendo a few nights later. A lantern flickered low inside the mess tent, casting amber shapes onto stacked crates. A group of women sat peeling potatoes, a shared task, simple and grounding. Across the tent, two guards sorted supply manifests, talking softly about a broken radio set. One of the guards, the young private who had rebuilt their fire, approached the table holding a tin plate. He hesitated, then placed it gently among the potatoes. On it lay a small square of chocolate. The women stared at it, stunned. Chocolate was rare, precious, a treasure of wartime rationing. No one moved. "It's from a parcel," the private muttered. "Thought you might want it." He walked away quickly, embarrassed by his own generosity. For a long moment, no one spoke. Finally, Aiko broke the silence. "We share it," she said. And they did, cutting it into thin slivers with a pocket knife, passing each piece as if it were a ceremonial offering. The chocolate melted on their tongues, sweet and almost unbearably human. The weeks drifted forward, indistinguishable at first, then marked by small shifts. Warmer mornings, longer shadows, the slow disappearance of the winter rains. Life in the camp, temporary, makeshift, stitched together with rules and restraint, ripened into something surprisingly gentle. Still rigid, still bounded by wire and watchtowers, but gentler. It was early March when the symbolic moment arrived, so quietly no one noticed it at first. The camp cook, rummaging through a storeroom crate, discovered a stack of tinned fruit marked for special issue. Peaches. Soft, syrup-bathed, a sweetness almost mythic in wartime. He carried one tin out of the storeroom, held it up to the sergeant and said simply, "Could mark the equinox, sir." Morale and all. The sergeant considered it. Equinox. Balance of light and dark. A fitting symbol for a camp living precisely in the tension between mercy and vigilance. He gave a short nod. "Very well. Issue 1 tin per tent. Equal shares." That evening, the women gathered under the mess canopy as the sun dipped low, turning the valley honey-colored. A single tin of peaches sat on a wooden crate before them, its lid freshly pried open. The air filled with the faint, unreal scent of fruit. Aiko lifted the tin first. She stared at the golden halves suspended in syrup, their color impossibly bright after months of drab rations. Carefully, she spooned one piece into a tin cup and passed the rest to Mari. No ceremony. No words. Just a quiet understanding that sweetness during wartime was more than flavor. It was an affirmation that something beyond fear still existed. They ate slowly, reverently. The guards kept a respectful distance, though Thompson, leaning on his rifle, allowed himself a small smile at the sight. Yuki swallowed her portion and felt tears sting her eyes. "It tastes like before," she whispered to no one. The symbolic meal lasted only minutes, but it changed something subtle in the air. Not friendship, that would have required a peace neither side could yet imagine, but a recognition that humanity did not have to shrink under uniform or circumstance. It could survive like syrup clinging to the sides of a tin. By late spring the war had shifted again. Command decisions rippled outward, reshaping smaller lives. Orders came down one morning. The women would be transferred to a larger internment facility nearer the coast, where Red Cross oversight could be established. It was a sign of increasing Allied confidence, and a sign that their time in Lambert's transient camp was ending. The news spread quickly. Some women cried softly. Others simply stared at the ground, unsure whether to feel hope or dread. Leaving meant movement, risk, change. But it also meant the faint possibility of repatriation, exchange, or simply better provisions. Lambert assembled them near the gate. He stood rigid, clipboard in hand, but there was something in his jaw, tight, reluctant, that betrayed his thoughts. "You'll be escorted in convoy," he said. "You'll be treated properly at the new station. You have my word." The women bowed, deeply, collectively, and that gesture, more than any language, conveyed what lay between them now. Respect, however fragile, built from weeks of shared survival. Departure came at dawn when the valley was washed in pale blue. Trucks lined up one by one, engines growling. The women climbed aboard with their few belongings, blankets rolled tight, notebooks tucked into bags, small tokens saved from weeks of careful living. Iko paused at the tailboard. Lambert stood nearby, adjusting a strap on his gear. She drew a breath, then bowed once more, slower this time, letting the gesture linger. "For your restraint," she said in soft, halting English, "thank you." Lambert inclined his head. A military acknowledgement, but his eyes softened. "Safe journey," he replied. Then the trucks pulled away, rattling down the dirt road, leaving behind a camp that looked suddenly smaller, emptier, as if their presence had expanded its borders and their absence now shrank them. The women watched the camp recede. The tents blurred, the fence shimmered, the figures of guards became silhouettes. Even the mountains seemed to fold behind mist. They were prisoners still, but prisoners who had survived with dignity intact, allowed by chance, policy, and human choice to carry something unexpected forward: trust. Transit to the coastal facility lasted 2 days. The vehicles crawled through winding passes, across bridges rebuilt from rough timber, past fields where farmers paused to watch but never approached. At night they stopped at temporary bivouacs, tents pitched quickly, guards posted. The women lay on straw mats under canvas roofs, listening to the hum of insects, the murmur of foreign voices, the sigh of wind over the hills. On the second night, Mari wrote under the narrow beam of a guard's flashlight, a privilege granted after she promised to use the light sparingly. "I thought captivity was a single definition," she wrote. "But now I see it is a landscape. There is cruelty in some corners. And in others, exhausted men offering their cocoa tin to a stranger. I do not know what to do with this knowledge." She folded the note into her journal and slept with it beside her, as though guarding it from the uncertainty of morning. The coastal facility was larger, more formal, more crowded. Barbed wire rose higher, inspection protocols were sharper. But Red Cross parcels arrived weekly, and the women received clean uniforms, plain, faded, but whole. Their names were recorded properly. Their status classified. Their health improved under steadier rations. The camp commandant, a quiet British major with round spectacles, interviewed each woman personally. He showed no indulgence but no cruelty either, just a crisp, unbending professionalism that reassured them in its predictability. "You will be repatriated when circumstances allow," he repeated to each. "Our duty is to keep you safe until then." Safety. A word they once associated with home, now tied strangely to the hands of an enemy who had chosen not to behave like one. Weeks passed. Months. The women grew accustomed to routine once more, though they often whispered about the first camp. About Lambert, Halliday, Thompson, the sergeant with the precise mustache, the cook with his equinox peaches. Memory softened them, turned them into figures of improbable mercy in a world that had little to spare. Some wrote letters, though few reached their destinations. Others kept diaries. Iko pressed wildflowers between the pages of hers, collected on the short, supervised walks allowed within the inner yard. One night, she wrote, "I did not think I would remember them kindly. But I do. What does that mean? She closed the book carefully as if sealing a truth she wasn't ready to face. By early 1943, repatriation exchanges, rare, slow, politically fraught, began to pick up pace. Civilians were prioritized. The day came when the women, assembled in formation, were informed by the commandant. You will be exchanged under neutral escort. Prepare for transport in 48 hours. Shock rippled through them. Sudden freedom felt unreal. The journey that followed was long. Trucks to port, a neutral vessel flying protective insignia, a slow passage to territory still held by Japanese forces. The seas rolled gently. On deck, the women watched the wake trailing behind like a path unraveling everything they had endured. No guards now. Just a handful of neutral officers who spoke little. As the ship neared its destination, Aiko gripped the railing and stared at the horizon. She tried to imagine returning to a world where her story would be met with disbelief, even suspicion. How could she explain that captivity had not been the nightmare they had braced for on that dawn beach? How could she describe restraint without sounding disloyal? How could she speak of decency received from those she had been taught to fear? Mari joined her at the railing. When I write of this, she said softly, no one will believe it. Aiko nodded. Write it anyway. The ship glided into port. Their captors were gone. Their memories remained. Years later, after the war had ended and the world had taken stock of its wreckage, scattered letters and personal accounts began to surface. Quiet testimonies of lives preserved by discipline, professionalism, and simple, stubborn decency. Aiko became a community nurse in Osaka, tending to families rebuilding their lives from ruins. Mari published a slim volume of wartime reflections in 1948. Yuki married a carpenter and kept her first child wrapped in a blanket she had sewn herself, the same way she once mended uniforms in a guarded tent on an island far away. From time to time, each woman would remember the men in Lambert's camp. Their clipped orders, their quiet fairness, the bucket of hot water, the small square of chocolate, the tin of peaches opened at equinox. Not kindness, restraint. Not friendship, discipline. Not peace, but the shape of peace hidden within the machinery of war. If stories like this remind you that history is made not only by battles but by choices, subscribe. We bring you more true accounts where humanity survives even in the darkest hours. In the end, when asked about captivity, Aiko would touch the edge of her diary and say only, they treated us as people. That is what saved us. And whenever she remembered that cold January dawn, the trucks idling, the surf whispering behind her, the dread squeezing her ribs, she returned to the first word Captain Lambert ever spoke.